Eric, we're going to do it again.
We do it again every time. Even the first time we did it again.
We did it again the first time because, you know what? We do it live. We always do it live. We don't make edits here. Not out of laziness, but we want to have that spontaneity, that air, the mystique, the feeling of electricity that naturally forms when you and I speak to each other.
Say the first thing that comes to your mind. Go.
Love you. Oh, so wait, did you say something?
No, you're good. You're perfect.
I was just trying to fill the gap. You know, they say that in like improvisation, you gotta like go ahead, like fill in the spaces. So I said what naturally came to my mind.
That was perfect. It was perfect.
Thank you. And that fits because we want to be of service to all the iron cultists. And as doing such, we want to take their feedback seriously. And so for this introduction, we're talking about nutritional competence and so many things that are important. How do people get yakety yak and stay yakety yak seemingly easier and easier over time? And of course, if you're once again on the internet, the answer is obvious: steroids. We're going to provide a little bit more nuance than that and hopefully give some actionable ideas how one gains said competence over time so you don't have recurring mistakes and you find with your fitness journey, you level up. Before that happens, we do need to read these reviews. We're legally obligated by our sponsors, The Pyramids. The first one, it's kind of apt that I'm reading it right now, Eric, if I'm being perfectly frank. It's a 1 out of 5. I had a comb for this one. And it said, the intro needs to go. Yeah, it just says, intro needs to go. That's the title. I like it. It said, good show sometimes, which I actually take offense to, if I'm being honest. But the intro banter is brutal. At least have timestamps so we can skip it. And that's very understandable. You want to get to the meat and potatoes. And we're like, no, this is a full course performative show. You got to partake in everything. It's improvisatory. So you need to see everything from the start. You can't skip ahead because then you won't understand what's going on. I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, and I mean, we did used to do timestamps. And by we, I mean Omar used to do timestamps. I didn't help at all in that regard. And, you know, then Omar got busy. You know, he has things to do. He's got supplement companies to run, you know.
Into the ground.
And into the and so you know what, when he stops doing those timestamps, it's because A, he's a busy man. B, I have no leg to stand on to ask him to do it because I'm not going to do it. And C, absolutely what you started with, Omar, in so much as this is a unified piece of art. You don't you don't go and look at the Mona Lisa and be like, you know what, I'm not going to look at the top half because it's going to take me too long to scan the whole piece of art.
Yep.
And you might be thinking, wow, that's a really strange analogy that doesn't even make any sense, Eric. And I say, hey, that's the beauty of improv.
That's hard.
You got to listen to it all.
And you know, it's kind of Chappelle said this recently, where he said when he performs on stage, he's like Evel Knievel. He gets paid for the attempt, not for the success of it, and that's what you guys get. Because one, we're not being compensated for this. In fact, we made the brilliant choice not to accept sponsorships and just incur our own financial debt, just to have that sense of obligation to one another. That's I think being indebted does that, where it's a shared traumatic experience. Like, hey, why are we doing this? Oh, love of the craft. That's what it's for. I do want to say, though, so the person said about the intro, I do want to say a quick apology if on occasion, because I saw that as one of the comments on YouTube, where we have a guest where it seems like, and it is the case, where I'll talk over a guest or there'll be an interruption. I'm currently recording on a terrible laptop, and there are sometimes significant delays where what you see, it looks like 160p. So not only can I not hear someone until 2 or 3 seconds later, I got to anticipate it. And sometimes I'll see Eric's beautiful face, and he's not moving, and it's like 1, 2, I'll count, and like no one's saying anything, and then I'll jump in, and then I hear the audio after. So that's a budgetary concern.
I think maybe the one sponsorship we did take from Sir Skype was perhaps not the best choice of platforms, but right. Now we're contractually obligated with Sir Skype, and that's not changing. So
no,
we just got to stick with it.
So we started with the bad news because Eric was the only person that's ever, where I said, hey man, you want the good news or bad news? You said, give me the good news first. And I said, Eric, that is very bizarre. I'm letting you know. So I gave you the bad news. Now it's time to read the 2 most recent reviews. And someone said, don't miss this podcast. Tommy the Trainer, that no joke, that's his name. Love you, Tommy. Great name. Been a fan since its inception. This podcast makes every lifter feel at home. I've learned so much about all aspects of health and fitness for a sustainable, enjoyable future in the sport. Whether you are new or a 50-year vet, I'm sure you will love this one. Tommy, TT.
Thank you, Tommy. And with a name like Tommy the Trainer, let me just say, I think you're built for this. Okay, you've been training your whole life for this before you even knew it. You like Tommy the Trainer. Honestly, I feel like you're destined to be a trainer of the stars. I feel like that is so marketable. And I would stop even focusing on improving your education. You don't need to be listening to us. Yeah. You need to be on the big screen or the silver screen or YouTube, or I don't even know what's the most popular platform these days. But the point is, it's time to go big. And you don't need any skills for that. You just need something catchy. You've already got it. Blessings upon blessings. Thank you for the review. In all seriousness, though, I have a question for you, Omar.
Yo.
So that 1-star review, is that from Canada?
So unfortunately, I do think this is from America. I could be wrong because once again, I search on my phone and it tries to geotag you back to your country. I think it might be America this time, yeah.
Is it a new one or is it an old one that you found?
Within the last, looks like 6 weeks.
Okay. So if the rating from Canada is changed from a 5 to a 4.9, then we can confirm that it is indeed not a Canadian. So that's just something to consider. And if that is the case, Canada, I gotta say, I'm just so impressed. You guys are doing great. Keep it up. You know what? Is Tommy the Trainer from Canada?
These are all American reviews. As far as I could see, it doesn't show once again on the phone. It does on the computer. But I'm going to assume. And he's a very real person, by the way, Eric. I'm just saying if we had to create a fake account to write a review for us, it kind of would sound like Tommy the Trainer, right?
I mean, yeah, I'd be thinking, who listens to us, a trainer? Or what's his name? Well, I just said the word T, and I'm not going to actually try very hard. So Tommy the Trainer it is. To be honest, I would probably go with Trevor the Trainer. Sounds a little bit more
Tommy is it's pretty ubiquitous. We're going with that alliteration. It does sound like we totally wrote a review, or maybe I wrote the review right before going on because the previous review was a 1-star. I'm like, I can't do this to Eric. I can't read the latest review and have it be 1-star, so I'm going to read another review.
Well, what people don't understand is that the main reason you don't have time to do the timestamps anymore is that making new accounts and writing reviews takes time. And especially at a certain point, you have to make sure you have a different IP address. So buying new computers, which I think is what you have to do to get a new IP address. Certainly. If that's incorrect, you know what? We don't have time to figure out if that's the case or not. Buying new computers and getting new accounts with different internet service providers. Omar has so many right now. It's impressive that he actually is able to keep the lights on because that's expensive, you know?
I don't keep the lights on. That's why we're now recording it during the day because at night, Eric, it's pitch black around here. So cue Mike Teixeira's most existential analogy about training in a cave. That's my everyday existence once the sun sets. But
you literally train in the dark, yeah.
Finally, before we begin the episode, I do want to read Carter the Smith. So I don't know why all the names are something but titles. He said 50 stars if I could. This is the most recent review. I would give this review 50 stars if I could. 1 star for each dang state of the U.S. of effing A. How does Eric look like both the before and after natty physique change of Captain America? Only God knows. And by that, I mean Omar.
Wow. I mean, he called you an omnipresent and omniscient deity and called me Captain America in the same sentence.
Come on.
Chef's kiss. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Come on, man. I mean, he knows we're top the pyramid. He knows we're dispensing this knowledge free of charge, we might add. And it struck us today. It tickled our fancy, I believe is the term. Eric's like, please don't say that. It's like, you don't look it up, no, Omar. Do you actually know, Omar, what I mean? Oh, the glutes. Yes. No, we want to get into the reference. Mm-hmm. But I thought to myself, I said, you know, I've noticed on their internet, and I experienced this years and years ago, man, where you see people that just seem to be so far ahead. And of course, when you don't understand the difference that happens over years of training, how your skills level up, and the variety of factors that take place into forming one's physique over time, the summation of the positive and negative choices, It seemingly almost comes across as being impossible. You see someone that they're just dialed in, Eric, year round, or they seem like they have better genetics because it doesn't take as much hard work. Where here you are trying to get in shape, tracking your macros, or trying to do some of these things. Your adherence isn't there. All these factors contribute towards you not having the physique you want, and you see someone maybe a few years down the road or also along a similar journey but much further ahead, and you don't understand some of that discrepancy. And of course, that could provoke maybe feelings of inadequacy or jealousy or any of these things. But we tend to notice a trend. people that stick with this. And that is, it seems like their skills, and by skills I mean the components that add up towards, someone executing something. So in this case, a nutrition goal, or lifting. We spoke about lifting, so executing a lift, get better over time. They level up. And when they level up, the results become, on average, better. But if we don't quantify what some of those intangibles are, it just seems like, yeah, I became more competent, Eric. Yeah, I know what to do. Oh, it's the tracking of the macros. And I think sometimes we miss some of that nuance of distilling what that actually what takes place. And you, I think, as a coach, as a researcher, are well positioned to talk about some of these skills, what they look like, and what this gradual ascension of the average lifter can look like, and what one needs to do, maybe through introspection or through diligent behavior over time, to acquire them in order to develop the physique they want. So I think this one's going to be another tentpole episode of Iron Culture, my man.
As in, you think about the topic and you've got a tentpole? Is that kind of what you mean?
I would describe it more like it's cone shape. It's more like a pyramid. It's very bizarre. We don't need to get into the biology of it, but
I think maybe you should, with a doctor, get into the biology of that, because it doesn't sound right, Omar. But that's between you and your doctor.
Yeah.
But I think you perfectly pitched that up. You pitched that 10 up. And the serious time. Yes, I think a lot of people will follow someone who has this quote unquote nutritional competence online. And because that is something intangible to them, and they don't necessarily understand what encapsulates that, and it's almost impossible to distill that via social media, they end up chasing the method rather than what underlies it, what enables that person to do it. And unfortunately, there are a multitude of methods which can be effective nutritionally. But what underlies them, if they are continually effective and they support a person in a sustainable way long term, that enables them to have a leaner physique or gain muscle without putting on too much body fat or successfully cut, etc., is this idea of nutritional competence. And that is an amorphous term. It's not a scientific term. It's not a specific thing. But I think it is a useful label that we can put on this, so we can discuss, well, what the hell is nutritional competence? And I want to thank you for suggesting that I might be able to talk about this. And I think the reason I might be able to talk about this is because I've tried to operationalize it. It's something that, now that I've been in the coaching game with competitive bodybuilders who are often at risk of having very unsustainable behaviors with food, and trying to figure out this way to blend the nutritional approach they need for competition with the nutritional approach they need for life and happiness, and not actually, getting ostracized from their social life and not just kind of descending into eating disorders, is a very difficult thing to blend, and it requires a very purposeful process. And I think early on in my career, it was, hey, we understand this whole quote unquote flexible dieting thing, this whole macro tracking thing, which we just talked about, folks, and we established how macro tracking is not necessarily flexible, which is a key kind of indicator of what we're talking about here. The method might look identical. Someone might use the method of macro tracking, but someone using it without competence and without the right perspective is going to have much more stress, and it may be far less sustainable than someone else who views and uses it differently and has an underlying higher level of that nutritional competence. So that's an example of the difference between a method and the underlying skills which support it, are kind of the buttresses around it, which enable it to be something that can be brought in at different times, modified, and becomes much more of a long-term skill. So I think because I initially started with just focusing on methods that seemed to be the quote-unquote best, and then I would have to deal with the fallout, either with myself as an athlete or with my competitors who I was working with, as they tried to then transition out of contest prep into the off-season. And we've talked about, the quote-unquote recovery diet versus reverse dieting as well recently. And we've talked about the challenges of weight loss maintenance. I think this is a really good connecting episode, this discussion we're going to have, Omar, where it ends up being the glue between all these concepts. If you understand why weight loss maintenance is so challenging, if you understand why the transition from a diet to therefore either maintaining or just getting back to quote unquote normal is so challenging, And if you understand how flexible dieting methods aren't necessarily always inherently flexible, if the mindset behind them is actually rigid, now you're probably wondering, well, what the hell do I do about all that? And hopefully that's what we can get across here, because I have had to develop, because I have some clients who I have now worked with for more than a decade, which is insane to think about, who I've actually watched them develop this skill, and I'm proud to say that I have been helping them do that, and it's something I've had to do with myself. So a lot of the times, this competence really depends on where do you start, and no one starts at the same place. So if you were a dietitian working with the general population, and for the first time someone is getting quote unquote serious about their nutrition or wants to make a quote unquote lifestyle change, that is going to be someone who with a different socioeconomic background. That's going to be someone from a different culture. That's going to be someone with a different family history and what is just habitual in their household. And that's going to be someone with a different regional access to certain types of foods. They're going to be living in different cities. And we've actually seen that cities that are more walkable tend to have slightly lower obesity rates. So there's a whole mixture of things that's going to go into that. And that's on top of all the stuff that we tend to focus on in the evidence-based community, like physiological differences. For example, someone being more insulin resistant or sensitive, potentially indicating whether they should have their carbs higher or lower to start. Or just differences in their kind of baseline total energy expenditure. Is someone more spendthrift or thrifty? Meaning, do they have higher or lower NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis? And then what job do they have, right? So all of these things are going to create a case study in front of you where you're going to make very different decisions, but ultimately you're trying to build the same thing, that nutritional competence, so that someone can start on that path. And I think instead, what most people do on their own, because they're not even aware of this concept, they don't know what they don't know, is they try to simply find a method. And that is why people kind of go through and get spit out of this recycler of the nutrition kind of fitness industry of, well, let me try this, let me try this, let me try this. And even in the evidence-based community, I think we have drawn up these methods which are based in thermodynamics. They're based in science. They're based in measuring things reliably and then looking at the output. But because they don't necessarily consider that concept of competence and understand how interwoven this is with our lifestyle, we have often hit these, I would say evidence-based coaches have hit these scenarios where they're just left scratching their heads, where, I've taught you how to track macros. I've given you macros. I know that this should be a caloric deficit. I've done the equations. I've read the research. And this should work, but it's not, and I don't know what to do. I've been there. And that's not necessarily a call out to our community. That's just kind of the reality if you've been a little more focused on the number side of it and not necessarily focused on building competence. So hopefully that makes sense, Omar. I mean, I've talked a little bit here to try to create basically the entry point of then going through the process of what I think is a good way to build that competence. But I'm curious to know how that's been for you, as I know you have thought about this from the perspective of a personal trainer. You've thought about it from the perspective of your own nutrition journey as someone who is interested in both being yakety yacked, but also strong. And I know that you've also thought about it from the perspective of making content for, kind of a pretty big cross section of people, which makes it challenging to talk about.
Eric, that's a fantastic springboard, and to set the scene of the slaughter, as they say, for this discussion. One thing, I think the first place that I would just quickly start for you to take over would be maybe a little bit the role of science and the benefit. I would say the benefit from the last decade, but the replacement of one thing inevitably almost leads to its own fair share of problems, where I think the fitness space amongst the general fitness population 10 or 11 years ago, there were still conversations surrounding, calories in, calories out. Is that even really a thing? Oh, I can't lose weight. Well, is it carbs after 6? And these are very earnest conversations. So, there's a lot of rationalization. Well, I think it's this. Well, I think it's this. I don't really know. The empiricism wasn't there. Like, well, can we test this? Do we know? Like, what's actually going on? And so I think the wonderful thing that did happen was that science pointed the arrow, the direction. It didn't necessarily fill in the map, but at least point like, hey, like, no, you want to reach where you're going, it's that way. And so that slowly over time, instead of people, because if you don't know, if you truly don't know what's going on, as you said, you don't know what you don't know, you're trying to come up with a plausible reason why you're not achieving said goal. So as we said, like your weight's stable, you thought you're doing the right thing. Well, maybe it's not calories, right? Because you thought, oh, it might be like I gotta eat fewer calories than what I'm expending in order to lose weight, but turns out I'm not losing weight. Oh, is it like I'm super insulin resistant, or I have I have like a high degree now, or what's the next plausible thing? Metabolic damage. So you don't know, and you're trying to come up with reasons behind it. And I think the benefit was that, at least with the science and the mountain evidence that then became applicable to the general population, is that it gave that framework of understanding. Well, wait a second, calories in, calories out, it's going to apply. But then the limitation, it's almost like, teaching a bird how to fly, you don't explain to them, aerodynamics. It doesn't work that way. And so it's like, I could sit you down and I'm going to talk, hey, so let's learn about macros. It's like, that's cool. And there's a high utility if you want overall competence and, self efficacy over time. I understand that. Like, let's educate to empower you so then so then you can make more informed choices. But then the subtle aspect, that's why I wanted to launch off from you, Eric, actually, with 3DMJ before getting into it, is that because you had that knowledge, but then it's applying the said knowledge to general population. As you said, you could know it's about macros. We all know it's about counting calories, but merely telling that, kind of what we said with Dr. Ben House, doesn't lead them to greater compliance. And so it actually, not that it's harmful, I'd say it's usually null, but occasionally someone now thinks, and we've had this happen, I'd say this is on the far side of things, but they think they're armed with a new set of knowledge, they're trying to use it, so, I gotta count macros, and then something happens, we don't know, maybe they don't count correctly, maybe they underestimate, all these things, cool. But they think they have the smoking gun, I'm now counting macros, but unfortunately, they're in the same position because the tool that they're attempting to use, it's a little rough around the edges, and they don't quite have even that skill yet. And maybe it would have been easier for them to focus on habits instead of understanding these tools and how they work, just making lifestyle adjustments. And so it's a question of, where do you go first? So I'm curious, actually, I'm throwing it back to you, my man, because I'm actually curious, with 3DMJ and everything else, you being a coach and then also a researcher, what did that evolution look like? Because I think your evolution as a coach would also then be indicative of the general forward direction of the community. So, trying to implement these things with clients, how does that look then? Like, how does the conversation start? I think one of the most brilliant things you said was that people, due to the variety of their differences in backgrounds, even the walkability, when we talk about that, like, how do you take all these different variables and start cohesively applying it to a coaching system that leads to client success? Like, how does it look like?
Yeah, exactly. I think you made some really good points there, in that we do absolutely need science, and I don't want to devalue that, because I remember posting on the bodybuilding.com forums when I was plateaued during one of my preps. And one of highly experienced bodybuilders suggested that the solution should be to increase my meal frequency with no other guidance, not to necessarily try to reduce my calories or increase my caloric expenditure, or, shift my macronutrients in a way that might, support performance while I try to do that, or anything like that. It was based on a false idea about how increasing my meal frequency would hopefully, impact my caloric output. That whole eat more often and burn more calories at the same caloric intake, and therefore be in a deficit. And I'm not even sure it was that well thought through. I also remember getting feedback from a judge, and this was at the time point where I had realized some of these things, and I was not necessarily, clawing at straws and trying to figure out why I was plateaued in the first place. And, their comment was that I needed a little more definition. And I was like, okay, so I'll try to lose a little more weight. And the response was, no, you don't need to lose any more weight. You just need to cut up the muscle you have. And the advice was to do higher reps, So those are situations where, if I did not have the scientific background and I was looking to these, ostensibly people who knew what they were doing, a bodybuilding certified judge and a higher level competitor than me, I would have not made progress. I would have, gotten better at muscular endurance, and I would have had to eat smaller meals and more frequent meals, and that's about it, So I think you do need the knowledge, but you're not going to find in PubMed how to help someone get into that deficit, or how to execute or navigate life's challenges. And I think the easy answer that is sometimes, or at least was given back in the day, was, you're an adult, you're an athlete, figured out, because it's either logistically unfeasible for me to be in your kitchen with you. This is online coaching, or I need athletes with a certain level of knowledge before they start with me. And to some degree, some of that is defensible, depending on where the blame is put and how you position that. So long as you are giving them like an informed idea of what you help them with and what you have them do. And maybe you even provide them the resources on the front end, like, hey, take this free course. Hey, watch this video. Hey, check this out. But I think that in and of itself is a large part of this. When Dr. Ben House talked about this, that instead of telling people just to simply pull themselves up with their bootstraps, think about competence and resources. And I think that really sums it up well, because someone needs the resources to be able to develop skills and understand what they need to know and have the time and energy to dedicate to it. If they don't have the resources, they simply can't make it a priority. Likewise, if they don't understand the competences, which we're going to get into in a second, then those skills are going to get misapplied. So as far as that evolution with myself and 3DMJ, it has very much kind of mirrored some of these aspects in the development of our community. That focus on tracking and reliable, repeatable information, and then dealing with kind of the fallout of what happens when competitors kind of go off the rails, and realizing that always track your macros and always weigh your food. It is a on paper solution, but it presents new problems. So it's been very much, initially it started as this kind of reactionary process. Just do this. On paper, it solves the problem. Oh, it creates a new problem. How do I solve that? Okay, we solve that, but there are different caveats and problems. Okay, how do I solve that? And I would say now the tail is no longer wagging the dog, which is a good thing, in that I don't feel like I'm being reactive anymore. I'm being proactive. So what this looks like from behind the scenes on the coaching side is we have a pretty extensive questionnaire, and we initially Skype with our athletes before we take them on, which helps us understand where are they to start. What do they know? What don't they know? And this requires some good communication skills. It requires trying not to make them feel like there are expectations for where they should be, so they don't, bluff, essentially, just out of this kind of emotional feeling like, oh, I want to please my coach. I want them to work with me. I don't want to show that I don't know something that I feel I should. I'm embarrassed about my relationship with food or my lack of knowledge. So it requires the right emotional stance, if you will. And then it requires a true non-judgmental discussion around where are you at, and that it's okay wherever you're at. So a lot of the things that I do now, instead of just trying to figure out what's the right calculations for someone and what numbers do I give them, is around, what are your barriers to success and what do you know? And what has previously been a barrier and what has previously been successful. So I think when you shoehorn everyone into like a macro tracking approach, you put yourself into a situation where you must teach them a lot about macros. You must teach them how to use food tracker. You got to teach them, should you weigh your food raw or should you weigh it cooked? Which entry do you use in MyFitnessPal? You got to explain to them the blue checks. You got to explain to them the process of how those food entries even go in there. You got to explain to them why they probably don't need to track potassium, but just focus on carbs, fat, protein, and fiber, and calories. You got to explain to them where the calories come from, so that if you see something that if you multiply protein and carbs by 4 and fat by 9, and it's way off the calories, you probably shouldn't track that one, that's an error. You got to explain to them how nutrition labels work, and that's actually the food in its raw state, in the same state you're holding it. There's a lot of that competence that needs to go into it. So you may need to give someone all that information. You may not. They may already have it. But if you don't know where they're at, then you can't give them the right skill set. So I think that's a really important piece. And we have a relatively extensive startup email with some videos and links that we have, where we teach, like I love to give people a link to our free course on sustainable fat loss, which Steve Taylor, RRD, did. And we put out the first video from that on our YouTube. So you don't even have to like go in and like give us your email to sign up for the free course. It's a lower level of entry. It's just a video basically on how do you use MyFitnessPal, how do you track, how do you weigh food, what state is the food in, all those basics I just talked about. I think if you're going to use a macro tracking approach, that's a great video to send to somebody. And then they can kind of opt in if that's something that they don't know. And it may be based on that initial conversation with them. So that is probably something that's not too unfamiliar to most macro coaches who've been at it for a little longer than a year. Like, okay, I have this system. I assumed everyone knew how to do it. It didn't work. So now I teach people to do it. And now I can blame it on them if it fails, right? That's kind of like, step one for that approach. But I think when you start to realize that is a useful strategy to get to uncomfortable levels of leanness, or when you need a little more specificity, but it's not necessarily a long-term life strategy, then you have to build a different set of skills. So typically, I like to assess on the front end whether or not someone needs a tracking-based approach to get to where they want to be. Because I know if it's not, because it wasn't too long ago, Omar, I think we've even talked about this, where I talked through like the phases of becoming someone who can do quote unquote intuitive eating, not intuitive eating TM a la Tribole and colleagues, but the idea of not needing to track. And it started with, okay, you got to track, and you got to get the experience. You need to have like the eye that can be within plus or minus 5 grams on what the food weighs. But if the goal is actually to get them to a place where they no longer track, is that always the required pathway? Maybe not. Ultimately, what we're trying to get to, if we're talking about, let's say, walking around at a healthy body weight and the commensurate body composition to support that health, where you can perform, you feel good, and you're happy with the way you look, which of course is very subjective. But if it's to maintain something you're currently not maintaining, what we're ultimately looking at is to create lifestyle change and habit changes that eventually become effortless. So what does that look like? And that is very different. Now you have to understand, okay, so what are the current habits that are maybe not supporting that? And then how does habit change, what does that look like? So there was a great article that, again, Steve Taylor wrote that just recently came out on 3DMJ called Habit Replacement, a Strategy. And I think what most people do is they will simply identify the habits that they feel bad about, that they think are contributing to their problem, that conflict with their goal. Like, I have a long, hard day most days of the week. So after work, I just go and get some easy, fast food. And it's really easy to overeat. I can eat it quickly. It's hyper palatable, and it's very high in calories. And we have data that supports that. Kevin Hall has done metabolic reward studies showing that ultra processed foods it leads to passive caloric overconsumption. Someone, if you just give them calorie matched foods with non-processed foods, so whole foods, and this is, again, they're not calorie matched in the real world, so it's actually biasing it towards making processed foods not look bad as they are. People will put themselves into, on average, a 500 calorie surplus and start slowly gaining weight. They'll eat the food faster, and they'll feel the same level of satiety and hunger. So that's not great for weight maintenance. So, okay, they go, sweet, well, I'm no longer going to do that. A lot of the times, though, those quote-unquote bad habits are in place for a reason. First, they might be a logistical advantage. I can quickly get food at an affordable price when I'm stressed and I don't have time to make food. Okay, so simply going, I'm not going to do that any longer, it doesn't solve the problem. That is now going, right, so I'm going to use willpower instead of doing what is easy, what I've fallen towards. I'm not following the path of least resistance. I'm saying I need to lean into resistance and just man or woman up, which typically results in eventually failing. And that's how you got in that place in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So that idea of simply stopping a habit doesn't work in logistical cases. It also doesn't work because food is not just fuel. It doesn't work in cases where it fills some emotional need. Most people, I would say, will make different eating decisions based on how they feel. Maybe not most, iron culture listeners during a cut, for example. But I think if we're honest with ourselves and we think about kind of our whole life course, and if we think about all the people we've interacted with and what's, normal outside of the hollowed halls of Iron Valhalla, we might realize that people eat based on how they feel to some degree. So if you're making a food choice that doesn't support your goal, because it makes you feel better, when you remove that choice, that is a habit that is quote unquote bad, you still feel bad. And now you have to make a choice about what do you want to do. So Steve did a great job of saying, hey, what we should do is make a list of behaviors that make you feel better, that are at worst neutral to your goal, and at best maybe even supportive. Like, do you like listening to your favorite music and taking a walk? Do you like reading? Do you like listening to podcasts, right? Do you maybe you have a one floating exercise day, that is just like accessories or arm work or something that are just composed of exercises that you really enjoy doing, like that gives you a pump or whatever your favorite thing in the gym is, that doesn't conflict with your other training days, that you can slot in on one of those rough days as kind of a pick me up. Now, instead of getting McDonald's because you feel like crap, you know what? I'm going to do some buys and tries supersets. I mean, talk about switching something that is potentially negative to positive, and ultimately it will make you feel better. So I think the idea of habit replacement is a much better idea than necessarily habit negation. And this is supported by data that I've talked about on Iron Culture before, the difference between approach versus avoidance goals. There's been surveys of New Year's resolutioners, and when you have an approach goal, it means that you're approaching a new behavior. You're trying to adopt something in service of another goal that typically focus on processes, which is how things are done and are typically more palatable and more likely to be sustained than just focusing on an outcome, which we've talked about before, versus an avoidance goal, which is like, I just don't want to do this. I want to move away from being overweight, and I want to do that by not eating these things. Those are much more reliant on willpower, which will tend to run out. However, approach goals are about adopting new things, about trying new things. They have an element of novelty. They're asking you to be creative and think about, well, how am I going to incorporate this new strategy or behavior or activity in my life? And that is probably much more likely to be successful than changing some of these behaviors that are attached to emotions or the logistics of your life. So I think that gives some kind of an idea of how do we set these habits in the first place. We can't just start negating habits. And if we do have habits that are identified as barriers, that helps us change them by doing something positive, approaching something new, replacing it. So the science does help us figure out where we want to get to. The science previously was just focusing on thermodynamics and the best way to get optimal muscle retention while losing body fat. And that can be pretty much well summed up to: don't eat too low of carbs, don't eat too low of fat, don't eat too low of calories, and eat a lot of protein, right? And get enough fiber and move enough. Once we have that in place, then we have a lot more flexibility. But the science around what allows people to walk around and maintain that fat loss is a very different focus, or at least it should be. What we should be focusing on instead is what induces satiety, what better regulates satiety and hunger. And then we can, okay, well, how do I get to these outputs? So my list there is, okay, I want to get someone at least over 6,000 steps per day on average. Get that activity level up. We talked about that J-shaped curve multiple times on Iron Culture. I want to get them consuming multiple servings of fruits and vegetables. I want to get them consuming that high protein diet, because that also not only supports muscle retention, but also increases satiety. And I want to increase, or I should say, I want to decrease energy density, which is also a concept I think we've talked about in Iron Culture. And that's simply for the weight of the food, how many calories are in it. And there was another study that was done by Kevin Hall in a metabolic ward. They compared ad libitum keto diet to an ad libitum vegan diet, or I should say plant-based diet, if I recall correctly. Actually, it might be vegan. I can't remember now. But the two groups ate a similar weight of food on average, but the vegan diet ate less total food. So this is an interesting finding where our basic operations, if we're at a relatively healthy body fat percentage and we haven't been calorie restricted for a while, if you give someone access to only a certain amount of food, what's typically going to be similar between two different diets is the quantity in terms of the mass and the space it takes up. And we can see that when we look at these kind of swapping of different foods, and when you manipulate energy density, so the foods are higher in water, they take up more space, they take longer to eat, we end up eating lower calories because there's a similar gastric stretching, and it also provides a similar visual cues and the same time course of eating at lower calories. So it manipulates a lot of the things that go into passive consumption of food. And of course, it's not just energy density, but that was one of those key factors that was in that Hall study. So we can leverage that, right? So this would be a conversation with the potential client about how do we get a plate that looks like it's mostly fruits and veg, a lean protein. What do you like? And okay, do you have the competence? Do you have the skills? Do you know how to cook? right? Are these things you have access to? Is it affordable? Can you get produce regularly? And these are, there's different answers depending on where someone is regionally located. To my embarrassment, as an American, there is really no such thing as fruit being in season or out of season because it's shipped from all over North America and you can pretty much get it at an affordable price all the time. However, when I came to New Zealand and I started writing nutrition plans during my master's study, my primary supervisor, who is also a dietitian, she said, this isn't going to be in season. And I'm like, what's that? So I had to change my meal plans to actually take into account, what's in season, or sometimes it is in season, but it's like 4 times as expensive. So it's not reasonable or it's not a good thing to ask someone to do. It creates a financial barrier. So these are all things I think you just need to consider. So yes, if you're going to use a macro-based approach, you need to actually take the time to teach someone all of the skills related to it. Think about going in an easy way to know what are those is go back to when you first learned it. Where did you make errors? And then teach them and walk through that. And I'll actually go through some of the most common sources of error in a bit. But likewise, if you need to teach them the maintenance approach, which is letting go of tracking, then you need to think of, well, what are all the things that people who walk around and maintain weight and aren't slowly gaining weight do? What are the quote unquote lean habits that are out there? And that is having sufficient activity, eating a crap ton of fruits and vegetables, having a low energy density, having a high fiber intake, which isn't exactly the same as energy density. They actually have independent positive effects. And how do I maintain regular exercise? Of course, that is often one that is typically ticked in our community because we're not working with people who don't like to exercise. If not, maybe it depends on who you are. If we're talking to personal trainers out there, 100%. Don't just train them the way that is most effective. That's great to help them get their goals, but help them figure out what are activities that they will want to do that will challenge their musculoskeletal system. How do we actually get them some loading so they can maintain a slightly higher percentage of lean mass and more muscle mass than the average person in the population? So those are your list there. We can fulfill thermodynamics for losing weight, and we need to fulfill basically a lower intake of calories that will result in weight loss without effort on the back end. And then all the ways to get there is all about what resources does this person need? What competences do they need? So I can absolutely get through that list to give some people some more concrete stuff, but I realize that I've been doing one heck of a monologue, Omar, so I'm just going to be quiet and let you say some things.
No, one heck of a job is what I'd say. Just a quick little tangent. Ursher style. I got another confession, Eric, this episode. Ursher.
Confess to me, my friend.
So, previously I had stated that me and one Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, D. Wayne, as I affectionately call him to you. What did I say about myself and D. Wayne, Eric?
Well, you guys regularly train together. He was meant to be on the podcast that one time, but yep. He was out there saving the world, so no shade thrown.
Yeah, so that may have been a stretch. I can now say this, and the only reason why I share that is that I don't want it to come across that I am saying something negative about a friend, what I'm about to say that follows, or that I feel like a scorned lover, that he hasn't returned my calls or messages because, in fact, we don't know each other. But I think it does encapsulate some of the issues that we potentially see in the fitness space when we talk about building competence, or I think what Dr. Ben House said, not getting easy wins or the constant momentum, and basically feeling I can do this. So you set a small micro goal, you achieve it, then you feel that you have the necessary skills to go on to the next goal, the next goal, the next goal. And the actual goals you have get larger and larger, but your skill set is improving that whole time. So it kind of matches each other, as opposed to, I've never lost weight before, I'm gonna lose the 50 pounds. And so I just bring up this example. That's why I say all the caveats before that about D. Wayne, to say that he's just a very public figure when I give this example. That's all. I do think, Eric's like, no, it sounds like you are a scorn lover. Maybe. Now, I'll just say very quickly that the element of masochism that sometimes is in the fitness space kind of goes hand in hand with some of the approaches. When he was recounting, and I think I shared this with you either privately, Eric, or maybe it wasn't in an episode, about Dwayne's dietary strategy. He's been doing this a long time, and once again, on the surface, it would appear he's in amazing shape, and how sometimes you can't just take the end result to be the actual best method towards achieving said goal. To your point, what the bodybuilding coach said about, like, yeah, man, if you just like eat more meals, it's going to work itself out, or you just got to do higher repetitions, right? Where the mechanisms aren't quite there. He was sharing basically on what his dietary strategy is to eat foods that aren't palatable, for 2 weeks, and then he has a cheat day where he could eat everything and anything and everything, and he highly looks forward to this day. So he incurs almost a food palatability debt throughout the 2 weeks, and he feels like he's depriving himself. That takes a certain level of willpower to get through, and then the reward is the food itself. And when he spoke about it, we spoke about Eric previously about food focus. His level of food focus was off the charts. We're clearly, because there's and we could talk about that, the same idea where you gave the psychology example of the kids where they're financially motivated now to draw art, and then what that does to them. But he's heavily financially motivated to look a certain way, and so he has that pressure. He wants to achieve the physique. He's found the kind of this like hack on himself that if he deprives himself, but he has some sort of exit strategy, he could almost feed into some of those unhealthy habits. And then it also becomes a reward mechanism, because it's a question then of effort. Well, I can do this, maybe other people can't. So once again, you exalt yourself that you basically incur a deeper debt of willpower necessary to achieve the same goal that unfortunately it seems like, and that's why the approach is real quick before you go on, that's why it's the tangent about competence and everything else, is that all too often it seems like we like to dive into that extra gear when it might not yet be necessary. Where it's like, no, I know you're all about this life, but we want the easy wins first. And that's why I joked, but I think there's an element of truth that with clients or with myself, I joke about the path of least resistance. Not that you're not hardcore and you can't hack it, but if you want to squat 400 pounds, I don't want it to be an RP 10 for you. I actually want it to be an RP 6 in life and everything else, the lifestyle factors, not just the actual execution of the journey towards getting that. I want it to be a life RP 6, because I actually want you to go towards a 500-pound squat, right? I don't want that end destination to be the culmination of everything you're trying to get towards. And if you build something up to be something that it's not, and basically don't have those systems in place and an understanding of yourself, you could make things all too often unnecessarily difficult. And I think that's one of the unspoken factors that I tend to observe about those that are truly competent. It's not this, I'm gonna make this grandiose journey out of nothing. It's like, okay, like what can I do that this becomes achievable for me? So it's interesting to me, Eric, the side tangent that I'm saying is that it's interesting to me how diet culture gets talked about in the greater culture, and then what gets kind of interpreted and what gets internalized by everyone. Oh, that's what Dwayne has to do. That's why he's in shape, because he's willing to have that willpower and I'm not. Side rant over.
No, I think it's a good example, because the only thing we know is that is something that he is sustaining it, and it allows him to stay in that position. So the end result is something where that binge day doesn't outpace the amount of palatability induced deficit or low palatability induced deficit he had prior, and for him that is sustainable. But it may or may not be for someone else, and hell, it may or may not even be for him 10 years from now. Yeah. Or at what cost, or what types of financial and social pressure are there that keeps that in place for him that aren't present for you.
Yeah,
and that maybe you don't even want present. So I also think the squat example is a really good one, and I think for all of the folks who are maybe a little more focused on their lifting and less focused on their nutrition, a really good kind of example of this is if you talk to someone within maybe, I would say, 6 months to a year of running Smolov, they'll tell you how, and not always, but the frequent thing, and we talked about this before, how they were stronger at the end of Smolov than they are now. And then it's going to take them 6 months to a year of doing something that's not Smolov, despite the fact that that was what got them the strongest they had been, to improve their strength and get back to it and beyond. Because we inherently know that level of volume, intensity, and frequency combined was sufficient to get us stronger, but also sufficient to prevent us to maintain that strength due to either mild injury, pain, maybe serious injury, hopefully not, or burnout, or some combination of the above.
Yeah.
So much in the same way that you might be able to tell your coach on your initial Skype, which I've heard many times, here's the picture of when I was the leanest, here's what I did to get there. That's not necessarily informative to me on what we're going to do long term. It'd be just as hilarious as you sitting down with someone, what's your heaviest squat? Oh, it was 500. When'd you do that? 6 months ago, I ran Smolov, and then, I hurt my hip shortly after. What's your squat now? 405. Okay, so what do you think about just running Smolov permanently? I think I would be able to squat 315 in a month, and then 225, and then I wouldn't be able to sit down in the toilet. That was what I think about that. So the same concept applies to nutrition. So I think that was an excellent segue, Omar, and I think it hopefully helps encapsulate the attitudinal shifts that need to occur on the side of the client. And that's something that should be a very open conversation. One thing that I always do whenever I have an extreme nutrition goal with someone, we outline what we need to do, the X's and O's, the importance of precision, and then I spend a whole lot more time staying in their ear about, and long term, it's going to be a very different process. It is a different skill set entirely. So I think we can talk about those two pieces in separate phases. Because yes, if you have an acute goal that requires restriction, then you want to restrict well. I think restriction has become somewhat of a dirty word on iron culture. But ultimately, if you want to get shredded, if you want to make weight, if you want to do a photo shoot, you're going to have to restrict yourself. And you want those efforts to actually be effective. You don't want to be the person who's forcing yourself to eat every hour on the hour 100 calories. And it's far harder than it needs to be eating, say, 4 meals a day because of a false belief about energy balance and like I almost was in my example before. You want all those efforts to be producing a result. And then we need to talk about sustainability. So where I think people really struggle, and I remember when I was first helping people track their macros and lose weight, and I didn't necessarily have the sustainability skills, some of the skills I did first develop were helping people track more accurately. And I mentioned before that sometimes I would make the assumption that if they were tracking their calories and they were pretty low, and I looked at their body weight, their activity levels, and they weren't losing weight, sometimes I would assume that they were eating off plan, or that they were just being lazy, or that they were lying to me. And it wasn't until I came across research just showing how poorly people are at estimations, and I looked at the reliability of things like food recalls, that I started to realize, the vast majority of the time, it's not purposeful. Even dietitians underestimate their calorie intake, not to the same degree as non-dietitians, but by a couple hundred calories. And there are a lot of sources of error. So, I've thought about what are the sources of error and what can I do to help someone not make those errors? And basically, it's just educate them on it. So it's give them that competence. So instead of having the assumption that they're eating off plan, the way to have those hard conversations of you're not losing weight, I know you should be. It's just thermodynamics. Like you weigh 210 pounds and you say you're eating 800 calories. There's no way you're not losing weight. That conversation shouldn't be you're lying, or even an emotionally nice way of saying you're lying. Yeah. What it should be is thinking about, what are all the places where they could be making an error? At the very least, there's two things that could be happening here. There's actually multiple things. One of them is a breakdown in communication, to where they just don't actually know, or they don't have the skill set. It's a lack of knowledge on their part. Another one is maybe they don't feel they can tell you about the times they're eating off the plants. And then, that could be construed as lying. I don't know if that's the most helpful construct of looking at that. And another possibility is they do have an unhealthy relationship with food. Again, that could be construed as lying. But again, the solution in either one of those last two cases is not just calling them out for lying. The solution would be to try to address the nature of your relationship with the athlete. So the coach-client relationship, so that they feel they can be honest with you. And then if you really do suspect that there is something outside of your scope of practice, to be clear, related to an eating disorder, is to try to improve that relationship so they're open about it. And then, again, resources and competence, the resources would now be not you. It would be someone who could help them with that. Yeah. But you can't give them that resource if they aren't open to it. So anyway, those are that. But I think the place to start is with the principle of charity, that they are doing their best, but they are just making errors. And when you really think about it, there are a lot of places to make errors when you're tracking. So I mentioned food recalls. These are tools that dietitians and nutrition researchers use to estimate someone's intake. They have 24-hour food recalls, they have 3-day food recalls, they have 7-day food recalls, and the accuracy is not great, especially if the person is not well trained in using it. And the reason is that recall is inaccurate. We do a lot of semi-conscious eating throughout the day. We add, milk to our coffee and think of it as a coffee, not as I had, 8 ounces of coffee and then 4 ounces of milk. That's just not the way our brain necessarily works. So when we start to see these high levels of systematic error in food recalls. Not that they're not reliable at the group level, they are. But we see these high levels of error. We start to realize, okay, how the person is tracking can influence the accuracy of their tracking.
Yeah.
So some of the first conversations I have with someone are, hey, are you waiting until you're home from work at the end of the day, you get on MyFitnessPal and you think about all the things you ate and then you log it? Or are you logging throughout the day? And if the answer is no, I'm not logging throughout the day, the solution isn't log throughout the day. The next question is, well, why aren't you logging throughout the day? Well, it's because I'm at work and it's kind of weird. I can't just be on my phone all the time. Okay, what do you think about just taking a quick shot? It's just a quick picture of the food you're eating. And then when you go over your food later at night, you can look at each one of those pictures and go, oh yeah, I remember that. So that is a great solution-oriented, not just kind of going, oh, bad habit, remove it. You're tracking at night, when you have the time for a reason, don't do that anymore. I don't care if that's, conducive to your life. Let me give you a solution that can work around that. Just take a quick picture with your phone. That way you're not on your phone for minutes searching for where's that thing I had at Starbucks. It's just a quick snapshot and then you won't forget anything. So you've now eliminated the recall error. And that's just one of many solutions. And I think good coaches will be able to think through other potential solutions if that becomes something they can't do. Another one is just accurately knowing how to weigh foods. This is just a knowledge thing. Should I weigh foods in their cooked or actual state? Well, you can do either one. Just make sure you track it the same way, right? Do they know that when I put a cup of rice on your meal plan, that means a cup of cooked rice, but that's actually only 1/3 cup of uncooked rice. And if you get that wrong, you're having 3 times the number of calories I think you're having, right? So that's a great example. And that's a lesser error when we're talking about, say like a chicken breast, which cooks down to maybe 70% of the weight that when it was full of water and uncooked. But again, that's a much smaller error than 3 times the amount of carbs you thought you were eating. Another one is the error of estimations. And this is one I think most people are aware of, that just simply when you look at a meal and you estimate it, most people are going to be pretty largely off. And that is going to be influenced as to whether or not they prepared it themselves. So estimation / non-self-prepared foods are kind of the same thing. When someone else prepares food, you didn't see what went into it. When you prepare it, you do see what went into it. And when you go out to eat, you often forget just how much butter and oil goes into it because that's what makes it taste good. And that a tablespoon of oil produces as many calories as like half a cup of cooked rice, So that disparity in size and the amount of place it takes up, it can really fool our ability to just look at something and estimate caloric intake. We forget just how many calories there are in, butter or cream-based sauces. So it's very easy for people to mistrack fat, especially since there's 9 calories per gram. That can skyrocket when they're eating out. So I would advise to people to minimize when they go out to eat during a period of restriction. Again, if you're going to restrict, you want to feel like your efforts are there. If you're going to a restaurant and you're already ordering something you wouldn't normally eat on the diet, you're going to feel restricted. But if then it's also 50% more calories than you think, you're going to feel even worse because now your body weight's going to stall. So you're not reaching your goal and you're restricting yourself.
Yeah.
You'd probably prefer to go to that restaurant and know to ask for things like, hey, can you steam my broccoli instead of using butter? Or, hey, can you cook my steak dry? Just use a dry rub. And do a few things that, they might make it taste a little worse, but you're already eating something you don't want, So I think being aware of those sources of error is very important. Non-self-prepared foods, you can't just assume that they are, like the person at Chipotle is not making sure they give you the exact, weight of beans or anything like that. So some of the ways you can get around that are by reducing the sources of potential error, is by basically assuming I'm going to get it wrong. So how do I minimize the error I can get? Most of the time you're going out to eat as a way to stay social, which I encourage. But now, okay, the solution probably shouldn't be just to never go out to eat, because then I'm going to deal with the problem of not having a social life and potentially harming relationships. And then having, more of a rebound or more stuff to deal with after the diet. Well, okay, if I'm going out to eat to be social, it's not about having the food that I've been restricted on. It's about finding a way to be there without it impeding my goals. So some of the things you can do are to minimize the sources of error. So if you get a boneless, skinless chicken breast and a double serving of broccoli, instead of a steak and baked potato when you go out to Outback, now, even if the menu said it was, a 7-ounce steak, and it was actually 2 ounces larger, and you didn't count the butter in it. If you mistrack something with a larger potential pool of calories, you can be off by a lot more. But if you've got a plate of veggies and some rice and some chicken and you mistrack it, the most you can be off is probably double-digit number of calories, because there's just not that many calories and not that many sources of variation. So instead of doing something like ordering, pasta and saving up calories for it, you might save 500 calories, and then to have on top of your normal dinner of 400 calories and go, oh, sweet, I've got 900 calories. And you track a dinner that is listed in the menu as 900 calories, but it's actually 1,500 in the way it was prepared. And you saved all those calories to essentially, you restricted all day to have one meal you liked to then stall. And that can be very frustrating. So instead, I'd recommend when people do go out to eat and they're not preparing their own food, that they get things that just can't have that much error. So they don't have to even worry about it, even if they mistracked it. So that's another thing you can do. In addition to that, I think people often forget things like cooking oils and milk and coffee and sauces in additions to beverages. Sometimes people they've always put milk in their protein shake and they just don't think about it. Now this doesn't often matter if it's something that you always do off season or in season, but if these are new behaviors especially, then that can change things. And some other stuff are just kind of things that we, again, don't think about, like bite sharing. Like you might eat dinner with your family, and your wife or your kid, or you guys normally just try things and you go, one bite probably won't matter that much. And it doesn't, except that if it happens at 2 different meals a day and it's high calorie dense foods and it happens over time, that can be a couple hundred extra calories per day, believe it or not. And then finally is volume versus weight. So if someone is, say, having a tablespoon of peanut butter, is that a tablespoon like you wiped the top clean and it's level? Or is that just whatever stuck to that tablespoon and then you put the tablespoon in your mouth and then that thing looks like it's already been to the dishwasher once it comes outside of that mouth? Those are very different. Like if you were to actually, and I've seen this, sometimes people have done this on Instagram, like they've done kind of like a heaping tablespoon of peanut butter and they weigh it to show it how much it actually is. And it's like 2 tablespoons. So it's twice as much as they think. And that's assuming like the tablespoon or the cups themselves are actually accurate. I've actually weighed out a cup of oats and it weighs, instead of the 45 grams listed, like 54. It's like 10% off, So when possible, use weight instead of volume. That's another way to make sure you're actually accurate. And if all of this sounds like, oh, wow, that's a great way for me to get OCD or super neurotic about my food, it is. And that's kind of the reality, that you do need to play that restriction card if you have these extreme goals. And if your goals require that level of restriction long term, they're not good goals. They're not sustainable. So ultimately, that's okay for a short-term period, but you then need to get back towards things that are sustainable, things that are habit-based, things that do go back to maintaining a certain level of activity, having foods that are satiating, but still eating sufficiently, and not having to exert all this willpower to track. So that's a very different skill set, which I guess is something we can talk about as well.
Yeah, Eric, so I'll just say as the hint, because I'm going to keep the anonymity of this person intact, I'll just say, Yaini, if you had to guess, let's just say an extra large pizza, one slice from an extra large pizza. I know this is super random. Let's say it's a pepperoni pizza from your typical fast food joint, extra large slice. If you had to roughly estimate how much calories are in one of those slices, I know that it's huge ballpark, so much variance, but at minimum, what would you think, just quickly?
So we're talking like an extra large pizza with like 8 slices.
Yeah.
So if it was a cheese pizza, it would probably be around 300.
Yeah.
If we're talking throwing some pepperoni on there now, or depending on how much there is, somewhere between 300 to 400.
Okay. And let's say, Eric, that there is, on this one, in this specific example of said individual, because this is an example, I would say, at the principle of charity, the person simply did not know, but to your point, the worst hurt you can inflict on yourself is basically to feel the deprivation, the mental deprivation that you're in a deficit in your head, you're making sacrifices, and then to remain weight neutral, or, worst case scenario, sodium and everything else, your weight fluctuates up a little bit. So let's assume there's just some oil on it, just before I give the actual example. So it's a pretty greasy slice. That's all I'll say on top. You can see the visible oil, just at the top.
Yeah. So now we're closer to that 400 mark for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So the person that had said slice and asked, because it's this first time I was like, I'm gonna track macros. They're trying to be diligent, and they asked because they had to estimate a lot. They have a job where they had to be outside and they had to be on the move, and so they didn't have time, or they didn't make the time to pack their food that they would eat on the go. Anyways, they got a slice of pizza, and they showed me the slice of pizza, and the person estimated it at, I think, 200 calories, and I said it's at least. I just looked at the oil. So the first thing I looked at was the oil, where I'm like, this is a greasy slice of pizza. Like, this is double. Like, this is easily double. And to your point, like, I think some of the foods that are they're just a hassle to track. You know, like peanut butter is an example. If you don't know that, yeah, you take the heaping tablespoon and it's double the calories, so it's like, you know, approaching 300 calories versus like 150, 120 calories. You're in a world of hurt, because if you think you're supposed to be eating 2,000 calories and that just bumped you up, you're compliant and everything else at 2,150, and then you do 2 or 3 other things like that, where maybe you're 10 to 15% above your goal that you had, unbeknownst to you, and you feel once again that deprivation still, as you feel like you're making sacrifices, it's the most painful feeling.
It is, and there are different behaviors that people have around eating when they're deprived versus not as well. Because a lot of the times, you know, and I've given this advice, is people will make an estimation of their maintenance calories based on what their weight's stable at, or what they're doing in the off season minus a little bit if they're trying to bulk or whatever.
Yep.
And then they'll go, okay, well, that is my maintenance, so I need to cut, you know, 500 700 from there, and we'll start the diet. But, you know, they're thinking about it in the off season first. They're probably not tracking, right? And they shouldn't be, in my opinion. So it is an estimation to start with. But then when you are, you know, like for me, when I'm right now 15 kilos over stage weight and I go out to eat, I'm not as hungry as I am when I'm 1 kilo over stage weight. So when I get a meal at a restaurant, I'm not chasing down that like piece of couscous and like trying to make sure it's also absorbing all the sauce and eating it. So I'm thinking, okay, when the plate comes out, that's 1,200 calories. And I'm eating, say, 1,100 of it, because I'm not chasing all the oil in the last little bit. I'm finishing my meal, and anyone who looks at it will be like, yeah, he ate all his food. But I'm not getting every last single ounce of food off my plate. And I tell you what, I have to stop myself in public from licking my plates clean at a certain point in prep, because you're like, I'm tracking that, I need that, I'm hungry, all I care about is food. So these estimations you have of what your caloric intake are when you're not dieting and what they are when you are dieting have these small errors that add up. And if you eat 4 meals a day and you are cleaning up the plate versus not cleaning up the plate, that can add up to a 3-digit number of calories over time, depending on what the total intake is. So that stuff changes too. So I think a lot of times we will ascribe some of this stuff to, you know, metabolic flexibility and, you know, being spendthrift or thrifty, or even potentially changes in expenditure, when in reality, it is just these sources of error that we may not be aware of. And there are a lot of ways to get around that as a coach, you know, making a meal plan for someone where you go, I don't even want you to track, because sometimes they'll get stressed out by tracking. Like you said, it sucks to be plateaued, but it sucks to be feeling restricted and plateaued, even though you're not in a large deficit because you're not tracking accurately. That's like a double whammy. And we have data to show that. There's a study where they measured cortisol in a group of women, and which is, you know, the kind of the quote unquote stress hormone, although it's far more complex than that, and that's not a fair assessment of it. And they also measured their subjective stress levels, and they had this in multiple conditions. So they had it in people who were dieting and tracking. So they were asked to track their food and count their calories, and they were supplied an amount of food that would put them in a deficit. And then there was another group that was supplied an amount of food that put them in a deficit, but they didn't track it. They just ate it. And then there's another group of food, another group that was given maintenance calories, but they had to track it, and another group that was given maintenance calories and they didn't have to track it. So independent of being in a deficit, their perceived stress was associated with having to track. So tracking at maintenance or tracking in a deficit both caused stress because they had to do it, and it wasn't a normal behavior for these individuals. And while cortisol was related to actually being in a deficit, which doesn't necessarily mean being in a deficit is like physiologically stressful. It is to some degree in some cases, but it's also a hormonal response related to needing to liberate internal energy stores, endogenous energy stores, not just processing the food you're eating. So anyway, You don't eat enough food, you're going to get food from your body. That has to do with the cortisol response. But the psychological stress that was reported was independent of being in a deficit and was specifically related to tracking. So imagine tracking, imagine trying to lose weight, imagine not losing weight, fuel on the fire, right? So, yeah, I think you want to remove that possibility for some people of being stuck, and then you may even have the option of removing the necessity to track. So sometimes you're presented with a situation where you don't know where the source of error is coming from, but you know the person's plateaued and you know something is off. And again, principle of charity, before you assume they're just lying to you, the next step would be give them a plan, an exemplar plan. Don't step outside of your scope of practice and say, hey, here's a way to eat that will remove the sources of error. I want you to have one of these 3 sources of lean protein. And let's say, egg whites or boneless, skinless chicken breast or canned tuna or tilapia. And then I want you to have half your plate consist of that. So a nice large source of protein that with very little fat and no carbs. The other half of your plate can be steamed green veggies. And here's a list. It can be, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, green beans, spinach, whatever you want, a mix of those. Asparagus, steam it. Okay. You can put, salt and pepper on this or any kind of non-calorie rub or hot sauce, which is almost always calorie free. And then finally, a piece of fruit. Do that 3 times a day, right? And then based on their size, if that doesn't get them to the protein intake you need, give them 1 to 2 shakes of protein. Boom. Even if they mistrack it in every way possible on that plate, they're only going to be off by like 60 calories. And it's most likely going to put them in a deficit. And you can adjust that to a smaller person simply by having 2 plates and 1 protein shake or something like that. So that type of approach enables someone to ensure that they still got the micronutrient quality, they still got the fiber, they've still got sufficient protein. But now, whatever level of competence they don't have, whatever skills they do need, if you have a time-sensitive goal, or they're just not able to learn in the time course that matches their time frame for needing to achieve their goal, now you can give them a quote-unquote error-proof process. And then you can, on the back end, look at, okay, let's talk about where this error might have come from. So they can still be making progress while you're still working through that educational mentorship with the client.
No, Eric, just remember, it's their fault. Blame them. It's their own incompetence. Leverage the feeling of inadequacy, and then use that to position yourself, one, as the authority figure, but then also to fleece them continuously of their money. So you set up a system.
The book upsell. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually just wasn't coaching you enough. So we're going to need personal consultations weekly. And it's like we joke.
No, Omar, you clearly are still a novice in this game. That requires your time. Oh. What you need to do is just sell them products. That was great, but I think what you probably need is this fat burner, which I get a kickback on. Also, I've written this fantastic book, which is really just a collection of my quotes from podcasts about hard work and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. We'll call it Eric Helms' motivational quotes. That just costs a little bit like $9.99 that you need to get because it's just that good.
Great name.
That's what you upsell. Not your time, Omar. Come on.
Eric, touche. Shouldn't trade dollars for hours. That's a rookie mistake on my part. I would almost call it Eric Helms at war with yourself, just so it really frames the mental makeup you want from someone. I will say, so that's a joke.
Fitness is a battlefield.
Yeah.
We are all soldiers.
Against ourselves. That it's unfortunate, Eric, but this is actually the truth, that a lot of personal training is predicated on that, on not giving people competence, on basically kind of looping them along and then rarefying some of the knowledge where there is that asymmetry where it's like, well, I know what you should do and you need to do this. That I think that all too often, if you could make someone just start out, achieve a little bit of success, get them motivated, engage, and then slowly start habit forming, man, once they start seeing, the results, their body image and all those other things, it's a beautiful journey. I just want to say one thing quickly that not to go off on a whole other topic, but when we're talking about weight neutral, and this we could have Jake Leonard and other people on to talk about body image, but also the avoidance. I think when you said habit avoidance, that is something so important to talk about, just either when it comes to losing weight or then trying to remain weight neutral, is one's relationship with themselves and their body and how they feel about their body. That it has been just my personal observation, at least because it's short term, long term, that if some of these things manifest itself of just feeling an overall sense of unhappiness, and it's not something that's ever addressed, even once, again, you're weight neutral, you achieve the goal or any of those things, just kind of the way that it takes shape over time, where you're always chasing after some inevitable goal. As you said, I think, Eric, you said a few minutes ago that if your goal is unsustainable, if your continuous goal is one of unsustainability, then you're just setting yourself up for failure. Man, I do think there is a certain amount, because a lot of us, we want to change the way we are in all the, a variety of different ways, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's almost internal work that has to take place as well, besides just external, like, all right, I'm going to do the habits. Like, one's relationship with themselves. It's a whole separate topic, not trying to open up a can of worms.
100%.
But just very interesting, man. That whole
Yeah,
aspect.
I mean, no, you're 100% right. That almost everything I'm talking about, and I hinted at it a bit with talking about scope of practice and in situations where someone might not have a healthy relationship with food, and also unsustainable goals like you picked up on there. This is all predicated on the person not actually having goals that are unrealistic, unsustainable, or underlying clinical or subclinical relationships with their body or food that's actually driving their goals, right? That they're not coming from a place of hating where they're at and wanting to change it. Or that wherever they got to, they wouldn't be satisfied with for underlying reasons. So, yeah, absolutely. I think, and the assumption that that is the case is something that I would caution people against. Like, don't assume that that's not happening. There's a large proportion of people, unfortunately, who that is happening for. And I think it's not your job necessarily to tell them you need to change your goals to something sustainable, but it is your job, again, resources and competence, to help them be competent enough to understand what is realistic, what is going on. Like, what does it actually mean when you see that on Instagram? Is that actually a filter? Is that picture actually from last year's photo shoot and they don't look like that right now? And that stuff's minor. More than that is asking them to ask themselves why. Why do they want to achieve this goal? Why do they want to look so lean? And hopefully helping them find something that's a little more tangible than I think I'll look better, or I don't want to look bad. You don't want it to be an avoidance-oriented goal, and you don't want it to be something that's not grounded in anything except social obligation or feeling like that's what they need to look like. Maybe they have misconceptions about health, performance, fitness generally. Maybe if they actually ask themselves, I think they'd be happy if they got to this place, which maybe intellectually they'd understand isn't true, but they don't even know that's actually what's driving them. Yeah. So there needs to be a lot of asking why. And the answer to you isn't necessarily as important as them figuring it out on their own, so they can do like you said, the personal work to be able to even succeed in whatever long-term goal they're hoping to sustain. So yeah, another really useful skill that I forgot to say earlier, just to kind of conclude this skill building, competence building aspect, is instead of, in all cases, like I said, maybe you have a time constrained goal, they're not making progress, so you give them an error-proof plan. A great way that it can expose their potential gaps in knowledge, but that also is a skill building exercise, is have them write their own meal plan. So if they actually have to write down the foods they're going to eat, the portion sizes, and the calories and the macros next to it, there's no way they can do that without actually figuring those things out. And when they get it wrong, it'll be right there for you to see. And then it's also a fantastic way to then have them go, all right, let's try eating that for a while. And what often happens now that you've put them in the driver's seat, now that they're autonomous, they're the ones creating their own plan, is they'll go, I'm getting bored of this. How can I change it? And then you can put it right back on them. Well, not just like, how do you want to change it? But instead going, well, here are some options. Let's talk through it. You can jump on Skype. You can give them like a video to watch. But now they can start to see like, oh, what are things that I like that are equivalent to that? Oh, instead of the yogurt, I'm going to switch to Greek yogurt. I'm going to switch to low-fat Greek yogurt. Now I've upped proteins, dropped calories, We can look at, swapping low-fat dairy for normal dairy. We can look at swapping potatoes for rice, which for a similar amount of weight, roughly half the calories. We can look at swapping out chicken thigh for chicken breast. We can look for calorie-free versions of sauces. You're not actually that hungry at breakfast, but you're just eating it. Okay, let's shift calories from there to dinner when you often get cravings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many ways to do that. And if you actually put them in the driver's seat and ask them to create their own meal plan, it exposes a lot of those potential gaps in competence, and it'll let you know what resources they need or what conversations to have with them. And you can also have them create a meal plan for, let's say, the transition from the diet to the long term. And then you can work on a new form of diet plan. Okay, now I want you to create swaps for your carb and protein source in each of these cases. So now they actually have to think about like, all right, well, I could have a medium banana or a large apple, or I could have 100 grams of berries, or I could have, X, Y, Z. And if they get all of these roughly calorie equivalent, roughly macro equivalent options, now you're building their repertoire of things they can eat. And eventually these become things that just become ingrained knowledge. And we start to go back from tracking. We roll back each step. Like, okay, let's just do protein and calories. All right, maybe we just do calories. Eventually, the next step, which I want to talk about, is how do you start building in the competence around maintenance? How do you start building in that interoceptive awareness? And this is something I don't want to spend a ton of time on because I've already talked about it on Iron Culture. Yep. However, we often just try to avoid or manage hunger or just basically accept it and move on, which makes sense when you're trying to diet. But hunger and satiety, awareness of those things and developing a close idea or let's say an accurate idea of those sensations can help someone manage their intake. There's data on mindful eating and there's data on basically interoceptive awareness in people who score high on intuitive eating versus those who don't and overeat. And it shows consistently that people who have a better concept of when they feel satiated and when they feel hungry and can actually articulate it beyond just kind of that binary black or white, they're more likely to be able to maintain their body mass and be able to maintain an appropriate caloric intake. So that's something you can operationalize. As you move away from tracking macros, now you can get them on a, say, 1 to 10 hunger scale, right? So you go, hey, what we're going to try to do for this maintenance phase is we're going to hang out between a 4 to 6 on the hunger scale. 10 is so full that I think I might throw up if I bent over. 0 is, or 1 rather, is the hungriest I've ever been. I'm ravenous. All I can think about is food. So hanging out in the 4 to 6, if there's also those other behaviors we talked about, sufficient activity levels to actually accurately regulate satiety and hunger, appropriate intake of fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, and fiber, and then a low energy density so that we're not having a hyperpalatable food environment. Now, all of a sudden, we've created the physiological environment where satiety should be well regulated, and now we're creating the psychological awareness of where that regulation is by now going, all right, I need you to track it. Because then they have to constantly think, okay, after every meal, how do I feel? Before every meal, how did I feel? Or just maybe throughout the whole day, what was the average of all those values? So you could do daily, you could do pre and post meal, you could just do post meal, you could just do pre meal. It really depends on the situation and the person. If they tend to overeat and eat past the point of fullness, maybe you ask them to do post, right? Because now they're actually aware of it as it's happening. And many times, especially, we just need the space, the emotional space to make a choice. People talk about like trigger warnings or knee-jerk reactions, whatever you want to call it. That often means that someone is reacting emotionally before they have the opportunity to think about it with their more rational brain. You call it fight or flight, call it lizard brain, call it, post-traumatic stress. And these are all like, semi-accurate descriptions depending on the scenario. I don't mean that as a joke by any means, but it's difficult to have the emotional space to make a choice when there is an emotional reason for eating or you're replaying old behaviors, habits, things that are automatic. So if you now think, all right, I'm going to track my food, or okay, now I'm transitioning to just tracking my hunger, it puts you into the part of your brain that's paying attention. It's now the choice-making part of your brain. It just simply gives you the space to note, oh, my hunger is actually now at a level 6. I'm quite satiated. Oh, I'm going to stop eating instead of just doing what you always do. So operationalizing, not only thinking about what does my plate look like. It looks like, okay, I just was on this plan where it was veggies, lean meat, and a fruit. Now I'm going to go, okay, a quarter of the plate now, instead of being half veggies, it's going to be a quarter veggies and a quarter protein. And instead of just those 4 sources of super lean proteins, now I can have whatever protein I want, be it, chicken thighs or a fattier cut of steak or eggs, not just egg whites, what have you. You change the options, plate looks similar, and then instead of regulating it based on what is the calories on that plate, you're regulated on I stop when I get to a 5 or 6 on the hunger scale. And I don't let myself get anything lower than a 4 because that's when I tend to overeat. And you track that until it becomes habitual. Then you can even back off the frequency or even the act of tracking once those things become habitual. So that's what that process looks on the back end. I know I've talked about that before,
Yep.
but there's still this tracking process. It's just changing what you track, tracking, meals and calories and macros, into then going into tracking hunger, into then eventually not tracking anything, and some blend in between the two in that interim transition phase where you need maybe some restriction to carry on to maintenance, but you're trying to walk it back and develop these habits.
I mean, you could do that. You could be Dwayne, and you could just you build up that psychological debt and almost necessity to reward oneself for the sacrifice you make. So I hear sustainability, and you know what I hear, Eric? Weakness.
Yes, 100%.
Because I read a fantastic book, Eric Helms, War at Yourself, or War with Yourself, and it set me up to understand that everyone's my enemy, and there's no greater enemy than myself. And so self-flagellation is probably the easiest way to achieve that. But that could really take place instead with my food choices through denial of self. And it's not asceticism. I'm just not good enough. Right. So setting up those systems in place, I have found have equaled unparalleled results. So Eric Helms, At War with Yourself. Check out that book instead, just to maybe open your eyes a little bit, because it sounded a little close to almost insinuating that feelings can inform your facts, so you have to be almost in touch with yourself. And I just say that none of that matters, because what matters is that gnawing emptiness you feel inside. And if you don't feel that, you don't feel alive.
Something participation trophies. Kids these days.
Yep. Something we know that line. No, but Eric, real quick, man. Speaking of weight neutral, I want to say that your help 2 years ago, not to go over similar areas once again, was instrumental for developing some of the systems that I personally found benefited me. So I spoke about losing the weight, taking some of the diet breaks. So again, the idea of arriving as effortlessly as possible, or not thinking about these things where it's just second nature, as opposed to, oh, okay, got to make sure I do this, got to make sure I do that. That when I went with the weight neutral approach, that for the last year and a half, where my weight would fluctuate basically between like 178 and like 184, so within a narrow band of maybe 3 to 4% naturally, not thinking about it. And even to the point, I joked about this when I saw my boy Silent Mike, and just their food choices, and where there's so many unknowns, and I just decided to basically get my own groceries, eat the food. Here's what I could do. From normally eating out a little bit when I'm at home, maybe 1 to 2 times a week with the fam, I just made all my own meals when I was there. I lost weight, and I wasn't even aware of it. I didn't feel that I was depriving myself. But some of those choices, once again, that you make, such as volumizing, so extra volume in the food, eating fruits and vegetables, once again, a crazy idea. And also being, this is funny, but it's the truth, with the onset of COVID and the pandemic, more frugal because the financial situation. Oh, like, I don't know what's going to happen. Let me maybe dial back. I'm not going to Uber Eats food. Let me instead, here's what I could do. Let me budget my food choices. Okay, I'm going to do that. Oh, I'm also not going to Uber anywhere, whereas like the gym's close. I'm not Ubering there, so I'm saving some money. But I'm going to go for a walk instead for that time that I normally go in, the 15-minute ride. So I'm saving money. I'm walking more to my destinations. I'm also not eating out. So it's predicated almost on a financial situation that then made smarter choices that allowed the continued success. It's kind of crazy how sometimes when you don't focus on the goal itself, it's like, yeah, I want to be weight neutral, or I like my current body composition. I'm like, okay, Omar, don't, like, as we joked about, you're in the back room. Don't F this up. This is your destiny here. There's so many eyes on you. It's just it's happenstance, right? It's occurring. And even that feeling I joke of lethargy, if I'm not physically active or I maintain some modicum of cardiovascular endurance, you do sets of 10, 12, 15, it feels kind of bad. So just maintaining that a little bit and feeling more, I'm going to throw that great catch-all, like an athlete, made it a lot easier. And that's why when I posted recently, Eric, it happened, I just want to celebrate, a personal shared celebration here, man. I posted a photo, an update. I hadn't posted a new photo because gyms were closed in 6 months. And the celebration is in the physique. Whatever, that's fine. Yakety yak, cool, whatever. Or the lack of a willful effort to maintain said physique. It was that two people in the comment section.
Splits in your upper chest,
bro. So Eric, here's a question for you.
That's what I was celebrating. I saw that and I was like, ooh,
bro. Ooh. So I could go on a far off tangent. I'm not, because I want to, but I'm not.
Okay. Comments. Comments.
2 people said, this lean and this muscular, I don't think you're natty anymore. We done did it. I said not even 2 weeks ago that no one says that anymore, Eric, and it happened.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this goes full circle back to the start of this podcast.
Yeah.
You were like, according to the internet, when you see someone who seems to have control over not only their emotions, but also their physique, and they seem to have success that comes reliably and they can sustain a physique that they want, the answers to the internet, Anavar, or I don't know, deep ball, whatever.
Right.
Just steroids, hand waving. And we find out at the end that is in fact true. Omar now is not natty.
Look, we're gonna have the great tell-all. I'm still thinking of my title, and I'm still rereading Eric Helm's "War with Yourself" or "At War with Yourself." It depends on what Kindle edition you get the title, but nonetheless, it's a bestseller. I know that.
Yeah, for you, it's going to be 12 years of lying about content when all I did was finally decide to take steroids.
Yeah, I took it to the next level, and here I am at the next level. I will say what is funny about that, not the comments at all, but just the concept of achieving a physique that you're, in quotation, satisfied. What does that look like? Even I would say one of the great things over the last several years was actually just working on myself and my own self-image and being comfortable at any weight. And then also getting to the brass tacks of why I do some of the things I do, what I enjoy, and interestingly enough, giving up is a harsh term, but I will say trying to make progress on the bench press was the one, Eric, most tied to my body weight that I noticed that when I lost some of that weight, it was hard for me to regain that strength. Let's say at like 180 I could bench 360, at like 190 it'd be like 380 or 385. It did seem that disproportionately as I lost weight, it was harder to maintain. Once I let go of that image of myself, like Omar the strong dude, or like maintaining my strength, and I just changed, so I started doing the low incline bench press, didn't really care at the weight I lifted, didn't seem to affect my muscularity at all, one iota. And then, the overhead press, I really enjoyed it, but I was only doing it 2 times a week. Let me specialize that instead. There's some missing areas to improve there. And so my satisfaction while training remained high. The compliance was also there, because once you let go of a little bit of that identity of what you have, and not that you give up on the goals, but it's like maybe you can't have it all at once, and maybe that's okay. Made one of the changes. So it's kind of funny, people think it's like, oh man, you made these crazy changes. I'm like, there's a few short things that I found easy to implement, and I didn't really have to think about it, and I've done it now long enough that this new weight that I would say in 2013, just giving some personal examples, before I went on the strength journey, I was around 180 once, and I was like lean. It was the last like 6 years of trying to get stronger.
Remember the tank tops,
bro.
We remember.
Eric knows the fabled pink tank top photo.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I let go of that identity of Omar the strong guy, where it's like, man, some of the sacrifices necessary in this, even the uncomfortability of eating food, it became a lot easier to revert back to not even a previous form, but like a previous goal with new skills. So I now see, I'm a believer, Eric, with my 12-year journey of basically weighing the same weight, like maybe gained 1 pound of muscle, which is the part that always kills me. It's like there's things that you level up on. Now I'm just going off, but there's things you level up on that people aren't aware of, like flexing and posing. I'm better at that too, which is fun. Like you could basically have the same physique, Eric. Like I'm joking when I say that there have been minor improvements, but flex better, and it looks on the surface, damn dude, you put in the work. I'm like, I did posing.
Yeah, I am kind of disappointed that the capstone Omar Isuf comment on everything that I've talked about is that if you accept being weaker and learn how to pose better, you can have the same amount of muscle and less strength, but look good in pictures if you just follow all the advice in our podcast. So thanks for that. You really got the people excited, Omar.
No, Eric, see, what's so funny is that people think it's like this momentous thing you do, and I am. The training and everything else, like hitting the all-time PRs and setting those expectations. It's like being in love with the process, and then also having, once again, some degree of that humility where you can be like, yeah, like I've improved, but like, let me be honest with you. It's like, I've improved, but maybe not as much as you think. Or maybe you honestly, it's the recency bias. You've just seen me soft for the last 2 years. You forget 2013, July, POG, Physiques of Greatness. Take a look at all the Texas photos where I was there. It's like, I know what I looked like 7 or 8 years ago. This is just like a return to form once again. But now it feels easier. So I will say that. It certainly feels easier.
And I think we've talked about this before when we were talking about advanced lifters and how much effort is required to move forward. That being able to sustain, 99% of your current form without putting forth 100% of your effort is the launching platform for then pushing yourself to the next level, and then reestablishing that maintenance. So it really does come down to kind of periodizing things, not being that person who was stronger 6 months ago because of small ov, but being as strong as you were after small ov on maintenance volume, being that then allows you to push to get to that next level. So you're just building that foundation for the next step, my friend.
Building that pyramid. I'm waiting for Joffrey Nipples to come back so we could really get after that training. Like RP 6 here to RP 8. We're going to find out what 11 feels like.
Yep. I love it.
But Eric, my dude, because I think we've covered so much, I think you did a fantastic job. Is there anything you want to either circle back on? You gave a lot of practical. Eric's like, nah, man, I dropped that mic already, Omar. Wrap it up for me, dog.
No, I dropped the mic. It's broken. It's on the ground.
It's expensive.
The only thing I'm going to do is stomp on it.
Okay.
Assert my dominance. Yep.
Yeah, make sure no one can use it. No one can use it again.
No more podcasts will be done after today, except for next Monday.
Right.
And the Monday after, etc.
Well, Eric, I'll just say then, thank you for being on. Thank you for being muscular. I think you gave a lot of different practical applications for people. Also, to conceptualize the way they even approach nutrition, the way they approach training too, because we did talk about training. So as always, a lot of golden nuggets. Not the golden ticket because we're not Willy Wonka. We're Willy Gets Jacked. We're Tommy the trainer here, who's totally a real person that I did not pay or create an account to make ourselves feel better over that 1-star review. However, if you want to do your part for the cult, because we are enlisting now, Eric Helms, At War With Yourself, soon to be part of Oprah's book club. She has a book club. We're going to be on it. It's going to go gangbusters. I can't wait for the Showtime movie adaptation that's directed by let's just say a director not of note because they're on Showtime. But nonetheless, it gets made because they feel that however small the market is, there is said market. So I can't wait for that to happen. Leave a rating and review on the old iTunes. We may or may not read it. You could go ahead and leave a comment on YouTube. We're back every single Monday. We appreciate everyone for listening.